Right. Okay, so thank you very much. So I'm Dr. Jane Waite, as Tonya said, and I'm a lecturer in psychology at Aston University. I'm also a co-director for the Cerebral Network for Neurodevelopmental Disorders. I'm going to be talking today about some research that we've been doing looking at person characteristics and well-being in Bardet-Biedl syndrome. These are preliminary early results and the research is still ongoing at the moment. But I think we've got some interesting trends in the data that we would like to share. Before I go on to do that, I just want to acknowledge the contributions from researchers from my lab. There has been a large number of students, research assistants, and clinical psychology trainees who've contributed to this research over the last 2 years. And also our wider collaborators from the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Anne-Marie Walker, Lucas Fogensteiner, and the BBS UK support group as well. So as I mentioned, I'm part of the Cerebral Network for Neurodevelopmental Disorders. And as a network, we're really interested in behaviour, cognition and emotion in people with rare genetic syndromes. And specifically at Aston University, our site focuses on the factors that affect mental health outcomes and well-being in people with genetic syndromes. And why do we do this research? Well, the reason we do this research is that over a number of years, the Cerebral Network, previously the Cerebral Centre, has profiled behaviour, cognition and emotion in 23 genetic syndromes, and now over 2,000 individuals with those rare syndromes. And what we find is that when we do this and we look at these groups, we see that a change at the level of the gene can have a cascading effect on development and impact a person's development in these areas. And therefore, this can lead to a behavioural phenotype. And when we talk about behavioural phenotypes, what we mean is a heightened probability or likelihood that a person with a given syndrome will exhibit certain behavioural, cognitive and emotional characteristics relative to those without the syndrome. So they've got a higher risk of certain characteristics. And that's really important because we need to be able to understand those outcomes for people so that we can plan clinical services to support people, particularly when some of those characteristics might be difficult for people, whether they're behavioural difficulties in children or mental health difficulties in adults. And just to give an example of this, so this is not BBS data, and this is data from my PhD student, Rachel Royston, who looked at pathways to mental health difficulties in Williams syndrome. And Williams syndrome is really an interesting group because we see around 40% of individuals with Williams syndrome meeting criteria for an anxiety diagnosis. And that's really, really high given the rates of anxiety in the general population. And Rachel was able to look at Williams syndrome and look at some of the phenotypic characteristics, so the characteristics that were associated with Williams syndrome, specific health difficulties and sensory difficulties such as hyperacusis, which is where individuals have sensitivity to sound, and link those difficulties with mental health outcomes and behavioural outcomes, and in particular linking sensory difficulties to social anxiety in this specific group. And she showed that this was a pathway that was demonstrated in Williams syndrome, but not in other groups. So it was really important to explain that and to see that, so that we're in a strong position now to think about interventions that might be specific for Williams syndrome. So we want to do that, and we want to understand these characteristics in BBS too, so that we're in this similar position, but obviously with different pathways for BBS. What I would like to say is I'm not advocating for genetic determinism here. So I'm not suggesting that everybody that has BBS will have certain characteristics. What I'm suggesting is there might be a heightened risk for certain characteristics that we need to plan for. And I'm also not advocating for therapeutic nihilism, where if a person has BBS, we say, well, there's nothing we can do about these difficulties people are experiencing. They're just part of the syndrome. That's not the case at all. And in fact, a review that we published in 2014 covers across a broad range of genetic syndromes, why, if we understand these pathways, we're in a much better place to intervene and to support people. So we wanted to have a look at these characteristics in BBS, and Phil Beals has already alluded to some of these in his talk this morning. But when we looked at the literature in 2018 and conducted a systematic review, we found a number of characteristics being described in people with BBS. And these were strong preference for routines, repetitive obsessional behaviours, and difficulties during social interactions, low mood, anxiety, emotional regulation difficulties, and then the hyperphagic behaviours as well associated with eating. And we looked at these, and then we went and spoke to parents and to people with BBS at the Syndrome Support Day and at the conference, and we asked, you know, what is important to you? What do you want us to research in the area of cognition, behaviour and emotion? And adults with BBS regularly told us that low mood and anxiety, well-being were important factors for them. And in parents of younger children, we heard more about the preference for routines, the repetitive obsessional behaviours, and difficulties with social interactions. And these are the behaviours as well that have been described as autism-like behaviours in BBS, as these map on also to the sorts of behaviours that we see in the dyad of impairments in autistic individuals. So we wanted to investigate these things further. And looking at the current literature, there's a lot of good literature published on BBS, but there are some difficulties in some of the studies or some limitations, and that includes a lack of comparison groups. So there are a few studies that have compared people with BBS, for example, to people with autism, despite the fact that we see this pattern of characteristics. And there is limited analysis at the genetic subtype level, although we do see that in some studies. It's not there in all of the behavioural studies. And there are also very few studies that consider the association between these variables. So, for example, we know that emotional regulation can sometimes be something that leads to, when you've got problems with emotional regulation, that leads to difficulties with anxiety and low mood over time. So being able to understand the pathways to these outcomes is also really important, and modelling that. So our study is aiming to do that. So our first aim is to describe the characteristics associated with BBS in children and adults and compare those characteristics with individuals without BBS. So with comparison groups that are matched on certain characteristics. And then to examine the characteristics that are associated with the poor mental health outcomes in BBS. And I'm going to present some data from our child study to give some preliminary analysis for AIM 1, and for our adult study to give some preliminary analysis for AIM 2. And again, this, just to reiterate, this is preliminary analysis. We only have a small subset of participants at the moment. So just to hold in mind, this may not be representative of everybody with BBS. And also, I would just like to say that if you're a parent of somebody with BBS, or you're a person with BBS yourself, the results that I'm going to present now are largely focused on difficulties, but we're also aware that people with BBS have rich, fulfilling and meaningful lives. So please do take our results in the context of the fact that this is only a small part of the experience of people with BBS. So the first stage of our study, so for the child study, we sent out questionnaire packs to parents of children under 16 years old. We mailed out 90 packs. We've had 17 of those back, so a 19% response rate. And the mean age of the children was 10 years old. And we've got a range of people with genetic subtypes of BBS in the sample. We haven't analysed at that level yet because we're still obviously collecting the data at the moment. But we've done some group level analysis, and we've matched the children with BBS for adaptive ability, age and gender to a group of typically developing children without a diagnosis of BBS and children with an autism diagnosis. And when we've checked to see if these groups were matched, we found no differences in self-help ability, hearing, verbal ability, mobility, or sex. Vision was poorer in the BBS group as anticipated, but the analysis that I'm going to present, we controlled for vision and it didn't make a difference to the vast majority of the results. Just for professionals that might be interested in the measures that we're using, I've just put up a really busy slide with a list of all the measures that are in our questionnaire pack. But broadly, just to cover what we're measuring, we ask questions about mental health, autism characteristics, adaptive behaviour and ability. We ask about impulsivity, overactivity, many different types of repetitive behaviours, so 19 different types of repetitive behaviours. Challenging behaviours such as self-injury, destruction of the environment, and behaviours that are labelled as aggressive, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're aggressive with intent to be aggressive. We ask about executive function. So these are higher cognitive processes involved in the control and regulation of behaviour, such as being able to put the brakes, stop a behaviour, inhibit a behaviour, to switch between tasks fluidly, and to be able to hold information in short-term memory for a task at hand. So these are really important cognitive skills for kind of planning and organising our everyday behaviour. And then we also ask some questions regarding factors that we know from other groups are sometimes implicated in poor mental health outcomes. So for example, the person's ability to tolerate uncertainty, because intolerance of uncertainty has been linked to anxiety, visual ability, health, the number of health difficulties, because obviously that's very relevant for this group. And we also include some questions about food-related difficulties, although we haven't analysed those as part of what I'm presenting today. So just some very broad findings from the study so far. This graph just simply shows the number of individuals in each of our groups, the autism, BBS and typically developing group, who are meeting cutoff for autism spectrum disorder characteristics on a screening tool of autism. So these aren't people that necessarily would meet a diagnosis for a criteria for a diagnosis of autism, but have autism characteristics. And not surprisingly, based on the previous literature, we find that, of course, 100% of the autism group are reaching cutoff. The BBS group is around 67% are meeting cutoff for a broad autism spectrum disorder, and we found one person in the typically developing group. However, what's really interesting as we get more information on this measure is that the SCQ data that we collect, we're able to analyse at item level. So we'll be able to look at what is pushing people with BBS above that threshold for autism spectrum disorder on this tool. And we expect to see some dissociations between BBS and the autism group when we do that. And for repetitive behaviours, on our repetitive behaviour measure, the repetitive behaviour questionnaire, we already see some dissociation between different types of repetitive behaviours. So we see high levels of insistence on sameness and repetitive speech in people with BBS. But this is comparable to autism and higher than the typically developing group. But for other types of repetitive behaviours, we see lower levels. When we look at activity levels across the group, we find no differences across the groups in overactivity. For impulsivity, the BBS group were no different to the autism group for levels of impulsivity, and both groups were higher than the typically developing group. And then when we look at mood, interest and pleasure for the groups on the MIPQ questionnaire, which has a maximum score of 48, which is the score for the highest mood, we find that our typically developing children have a median score of around 41. The autism group have a median score of around 37. And the BBS group are significantly lower on mood, interest and pleasure, scoring around 29. Now, this again doesn't mean that this is very, very low. It just means it's significant statistically different. This seems to be a mid-level score, but it is something that we do need to follow up with this group to truly understand kind of what is driving that lower mood, as that might be something that's particularly clinically important to note. And then for behaviours that challenge, we haven't done the group comparisons yet, but I just want to draw your attention to the high levels of physical aggression that were reported by parents and carers in the last month in their children with BBS, with 47% of families noting that there was some form of physical aggression. And again, we know that these sorts of behaviours can put a lot of pressure on families. They can be very worrying for families in terms of what they mean and what to do about them. And we have very good protocols in place for signposting people to information about these behaviours for early intervention. So knowing that this is the case for this group can be very helpful for signposting people onto the relevant information. Now, just quickly, I just want to talk now about some of the over 16s data that was collected by my clinical psychology doctorate student, Neelam. Again, we have small numbers at the moment, only 18 people with BBS, and the mean age being 39. And most of these people had BBS 1. There's a typo there on my slide, BBS 1. They were a very able group of individuals who were able to self-report, and they self-reported on questionnaires and told us about sight, autism characteristics, health difficulties, intolerance of uncertainty, executive function difficulties, and anxiety and depression. And what we were interested in is whether these characteristics would predict anxiety and depression, as previous literature and models of anxiety would suggest that they might. And when we looked at these data, we found that 5 participants met cutoff for clinically significant anxiety and 4 for depression, which is far higher than we would expect in the general population. And then when we look at associations between the different variables that we measured and the different factors that we measured, we found that anxiety and depression were very highly correlated in these 18 individuals, which again is what we would expect. Anxiety and depression often co-occur together. And we found that for anxiety, the number of health difficulties reported in the last month, the person's degree of intolerance of uncertainty, so the less they could tolerate uncertainty, and their executive function abilities, so the more difficulty they had with planning and regulating the behaviours, the more likely they were to experience anxiety. And this replicates results that models that have been tested in autistic individuals as well. And we find a similar pattern for depression, but the results are not quite as strong in terms of statistical significance, but we do see the same trends there. Then for just at the bottom, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that autism characteristics in the group were also strongly associated with these executive function difficulties. And again, this replicates what we would expect to see based on previous literature linking executive function difficulties to autism characteristics more broadly. So what we're starting to see here is the beginning of a model for anxiety and depression in BBS that might give us some real places for intervention to help, particularly at an early stage, to help people manage their anxiety or develop their ability to tolerate uncertainty. There are numerous interventions starting to come through for, in genetic syndromes that look at helping people manage these difficult feelings that are showing real promise, that may be able to be transferred to the BBS group based on these findings. I'm now going to hand over to Lauren, who's just going to talk a little bit about how to get involved in the study. I think I've probably spoken for too long, so hopefully you've got enough time, Lauren. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and hand back to Lauren.
Thanks, Jane. So hi, I'm Lauren Shelley and I'm a researcher at Aston University. And as Jane's just said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how families can get involved in the study, and a little bit about what the next stages are. So as we've just heard from Jane, there are findings emerging from our data that look like they might be really important for people with BBS and their families, but we need more people to take part so that we can work out whether they're representative of the majority of people with BBS or a smaller group of people. And the more people who take part, the more useful and meaningful the findings will be, and we'll be able to use them to advocate for additional support for people with BBS. So we're looking for more parents of children to give an hour of their time to complete a questionnaire pack about their child, and that can be either online, over the phone, or by paper copy in the post. And all parents would receive a feedback report about their child. And we need as many families as possible to take part, so even if they have as little to report to us in terms of difficulties that their child is experiencing. And this is because it will help us to answer the question about how many people our findings are relevant for. And also, if you can get enough families to take part, it will mean that we're able to look at differences across different genetic causes of BBS. So comparing people with BBS 1 to BBS 10, which is important because, as Jane has mentioned, changes in different genes may have a differential impact on the person's development and outcomes. And so by describing these findings, we'll be able to inform future or plan better for children and adults with BBS. So as well as children with BBS, we're also looking for more adults with BBS to take part, and where possible, we'd like for 2 people to take part, so the adult with BBS and someone who knows them well. So if you're an adult with BBS taking part, you'd be asked to speak to us over the phone about your experiences. And then if you're the person that knows the adult with BBS well, you'll be asked to complete a questionnaire about the person with BBS's characteristics and behaviour with the consent of the adult with BBS. But we know that it's not also always possible or even appropriate for both the person with BBS and someone who knows them well to take part. So there are different options, and sometimes it might be that it's just the adult with BBS that would like to take part by themselves. And sometimes it may be that the parent or friend completes some questionnaires about the person with BBS, but the adult with BBS doesn't take part themselves. And this can be maybe because they have a greater degree of developmental delay, or because they might find taking part difficult. So we just wanted to tell you a little bit about the different ways that you can get involved and express an interest in the research. So there are different ways to do this. So people can call our study mobile number, which is 07846 394 511. And we ask that people would leave a message with their name and number and just mention that they're interested in the BBS project. Or you can email Jane at j.waite@aston.ac.uk. And we'll also ask BBS UK to share a link to our online expression of interest form, and anyone who's interested can complete this to express their interest. And I'll just repeat the study mobile number in a couple of minutes at the end of the talk for anyone who wants to take that down. So finally, we'd just like to let you know that in the next 18 months, we'll be starting the next stage of the research as well, where we hope to meet people with BBS, hopefully in person, but if not, then via web call, to complete some assessments that will help us to further understand what might lead to low mood and anxiety, which is something that we've identified to be really important for people with BBS. So for example, we'll be asking people with BBS to complete behavioural assessments that look at intolerance of uncertainty, so that we can validate the findings from the questionnaires completed in stage 1. And just to say that if families do take part in the questionnaires in stage 1, then it doesn't mean that they have to complete this assessment day in stage 2. It's up to families to decide whether they'd like to do this as well. But we just wanted to mention the assessment day just to let you know that this is how the research will be continuing after stage 1, And also just to say that the findings from the questionnaires in stage 1 will help to inform the research questions for this second stage. So the study number for anyone who wanted to take this down was 07846 394 511. And we just wanted to say thank you to all of the people with BBS and their families who've taken part so far for making the research possible, and also thank you to our wider research team of collaborators.